My name is Eduardo Gamarra. I'm a professor in the Politics and International Relations Department at FIU, and I also am the director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at the Jack D. Gordon Institute. We conducted a survey of Latinos in Florida with a particular focus on Cubans and Venezuelans. So we oversampled Cubans and Venezuelans. We also surveyed other populations here, Colombians, Nicaraguans, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans. In a sense, you can almost kind of look at these as two different surveys, one on Cubans and Venezuelans and another one on the other Latinos. But our interest was sort of knowing where they sit on issues related specifically to Venezuela more than anything else. But we began with a very broad question about how important foreign policy is to their process of voting for a particular candidate. And this is a question that's been asked several times in several different ways in other surveys. But we were particularly surprised by the answer that across all groups, foreign policy seems to be either very important or important, so that over 50% in all of the samples, in all of the cases, said that foreign policy was important. But we went a step further, and we also asked, in the process of selecting a candidate, whether they considered what the situation was back home, and so for example, we were particularly interested in how Cubans might think about what's going on in Cuba in the end in their decision to select a candidate here, or Venezuelans, right, and the stance of candidates here about the situation in Venezuela. And again, it was quite surprising to see how important of a consideration it is to look at what's going on back home to decide on who to vote. So those two very important takeaways from the survey, I think, sort of tell us, right, that Latinos in general, especially here in South Florida, right, when it's their time to vote, they look at how Washington stands on foreign policy issues in relationship to their country of origin. And they also look at what's going on domestically back home in their country of origin. And that influences, of course, their decision on whether to support one candidate or another. The gist of the survey, though, was really exploring how Florida Latinos feel about U.S. policy toward Venezuela, and in particular the sanctions that have been imposed on the government of Venezuela. It's important to note, of course, that the U.S. has had sanctions on Venezuela since 2006. These have intensified over each administration, leading today to what some call the maximum pressure, right, largely imposed by President Trump. And so we asked a series of questions on whether there was an approval of these sanctions, and one in particular that we asked was whether there was support for the policy of maximum pressure. And what we found is really kind of an interesting response there, that there was a significant amount of disapproval, right, and something that we frankly were surprised, and especially when you look at the responses, for example, from Venezuelans, that 37% of Venezuelans said that they disapproved of the policy of maximum pressure. And that was a huge surprise, because we expected Venezuelans in this community in particular to be very supportive of maximum pressure sanctions. And so in a way, in trying to calibrate this a little bit, we also said, well, there's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and who's caused this humanitarian crisis? A lot of the propaganda that came out of the Venezuelan government was that it was the government, part of the United States, and these sanctions that were responsible. But here it's interesting, right, that the community here and the Latino community feels very strongly that it's the Maduro government that causes the greatest part of the sanctions. But there's a significant difference between, for example, how Cubans respond to this and Venezuelans. 52.6% of Cubans feel that it's the Maduro government, but only 41.2% of Venezuelans do, right? Again, well under 50%. 21% of Venezuelans think that it's both. It's U.S. sanctions and the Maduro government. So here, what we have been gauging in this survey is a more critical view of those sanctions, and not this, this outright endorsement of the sanctions. Now, at the same time, this community doesn't really support negotiations. And so we asked, for example, do you support the negotiations in Mexico, which are apparently now going to be restarted? The vast majority of Venezuelans in Miami, in Florida, do not approve of the opening of negotiations with the Maduro regime. So they're critical of the sanctions, but they're also not so enthusiastic about reopening negotiations in Mexico. But clearly, I think it's what direction forward should be taken on sanctions. And so we asked a question that sort of got to the core of have sanctions worked, right? Remember, I said sanctions started in 2006, and how have they worked or have they not worked? So we asked the question, in your opinion, has the Biden administration's policy of individual sanctions against people like Nicolás Maduro, like Diosdado, like Delcy Rodriguez, Tarek El Aissami, and others, has that policy exceeded your expectations? Has it met your expectations, or has it failed to meet your expectations? And we were really quite surprised to find that if you sum below expectations and failed to meet your expectations, that almost 65% fall in that category. In other words, there's this sense that sanctions don't work, that they have not met the expectations of the community. Now, so what to do then, right? And here I think that there's a very strong sentiment that the U.S. and the international community need to be much more proactive on humanitarian assistance. In sum, there appears to be a sense that sanctions have not worked, and the idea that as long as there is a humanitarian component to any kind of modification of sanctions, that the community here would be open to it. Of course, the one caveat is that nothing involving revenue going to the Maduro government would be tolerated by this community. So humanitarian assistance, even the lifting of sanctions on oil, or particularly on oil, but as long as no revenue goes to the Maduro regime.